Samantha Wells walked from the bathroom to her dimly lit employee lounge. As she moved, she adjusted her uniform in a very subtle way, hoping that no one would see the nervous energy oozing around her. She wasn't usually the type to be anxious, but she had just returned from a 1-month-long suspension, and she did not want to do anything that would take her back to the loneliness of her house. Samantha never believed that she deserved that suspension. After all, the only thing that happened was a minor argument with an arrogant first-class passenger. The passenger escalated the matter to a formal complaint, and her bosses deemed her unprofessional. Unprofessional. That word alone haunted her for hours, and now she was determined to show them just how professional she indeed was. She would follow every single ridiculous rule to the letter. There would be no mistake this time. As she took her first steps toward Gate 47, she was enveloped by the usual airport chaos buzzing all around her. She saw crying babies, the perched sounds of flight announcements, and the impatient businessmen constantly checking their watches, and she knew she was back. Taking a deep breath, she forced a smile and resolved to do everything by the book. Immediately she opened her eyes, and she saw her. Karoline Leavitt. Samantha had not been living under a rock, so she knew precisely who Karoline was. She was a firebrand, and her brand was known for its unapologetic takes and clashes with the media. Samantha had watched enough televised debates to know that she was high class. But now, after seeing her in person, every inch of her screamed confidence. From her blonde hair, which was wrapped in a very elegant bun, to the crisp designer blazer she wore, and, finally, the small American flag pin she had on her lapel, Samantha could tell that she was one of the proud ones, and this realization made her stomach twist. For many years, Samantha has advocated for a progressive cause, which simply meant that everything Karoline stood for was a threat to her. Unfortunately for Karoline, fate had placed her boarding process in Samantha's hands. For a moment, Samantha was determined to wreck her, but then she remembered that she was determined to follow everything by the book, so she slowly put aside her grievances and decided to do her work. She plastered a fake smile on her face and watched as the line of passengers reduced till finally, Karoline was in front of her. The young lady smiled and softly handed her boarding pass to Samantha, who could quickly tell she was used to the first-class treatment. Samantha smiled and proceeded to scan the document. Immediately, her soft smile turned to a frown. She did not hope for this, but there was a discrepancy. It wasn't a major one, and most gate agents would normally overlook it. But still, it was a clerical error. So, what was this error? The system had actually flagged an inconsistency between the name used to book the reservation and the name on the ID. On one, it was Leavitt Karoline, and on the other, it was Karoline M. Leavitt. Samantha knew that this was a very minor issue, but today was different, and Samantha had something to prove to her bosses. Placing the boarding pass back on the counter, she said with a smile, "I'm so sorry, Ms. Leavitt, but there appears to be an issue with the boarding pass." Karoline was taken aback. She wasn't the type of person to make mistakes, so this came as a shock to her. "What issue are you talking about?" "Well," Samantha said as she turned the monitor to let her see the red flag notification, "the name on your ID doesn't actually match the name on the reservation, and I am afraid I won't be able to let you board unless this is corrected." Karoline looked at her dumbfounded. She had a small smile on her face as she waited for Samantha to laugh and tell her it was a joke. When that didn't happen, she gave a small laugh. "You're joking, right? This is just a simple clerical error, and you know it. It happens all the time." "I understand that, Ma, but in accordance with TSA regulations, it is required that—" "Nothing is required," Karoline cut in, slowly getting frustrated, and Samantha could tell because she had seen that face one too many times on television. "Listen to me, miss. I have flown over 100 times with my middle initial missing, and no one has even told me that I can't board. This is absolutely ridiculous." Samantha could feel her anger rising in her chest. She hated being told how to do her job, which was exactly what Karoline was trying to do. But she knew she could not lose her cool, so calmly she said, "Ma, I have to follow protocol. This is my job." The more Karoline listened to her, the more her jaw tightened, and it was fun to watch for Samantha. She had to try so hard to hide her smile, but from the corner of her eyes, she could see that the passengers were beginning to notice. A few of them even pulled out their phones, hoping to get every single detail of the exchange. Was she being petty? Maybe. Did she enjoy it? Fully. "Let me get this straight. You actually want to deny me boarding because of a typo? Caroline's voice was becoming sharper, but it didn't scare Samantha. She was well within her rights, and no one would suspend her for following the rules this time. Trust me on this. I am not denying you anything. I am simply asking you to do the right thing and resolve this discrepancy before I can board you, Samantha said, keeping her voice totally neutral. Soon, the little crowd that had gathered began to murmur. They all knew exactly what was happening. After all, it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. This was a viral moment, and soon, clips of it would be all over social media. But Karoline wasn't afraid of bad press. She has had her fair share of it. She moved closer to Samantha and said, "Listen, I know what's happening here. You just don't like me, and I am guessing it's because you disagree with every single thing that I stand for. But for the love of God, don't use your little power here to play politics. You should be better than that." At that moment, Samantha doubted her actions, but then she blinked it away. Her assurance? She was simply following the rules. "I understand your frustration, Ma, and I am sorry, but I can't let you board," she said again, this time more loudly, hoping that the crowd would hear it. Karoline looked at her in anger, but Samantha still managed to see something unreadable pass through her expression, and to her, it felt like a warning. "Fine, since this is what you want," Carolina said as she took a few steps back, but before she left, she locked eyes with Samantha and said, "You are definitely going to regret this." With that, she took her bag and walked away, disappearing among the crowd. Samantha stood there, stiffened. She knew the truth. She had just made a very powerful woman her enemy. This was worse than being suspended. She was jolted back by the sound of the final boarding call ringing, and finally, every straggler boarded as the door closed, and the flight took off without Karoline Leavitt on board. Then, the nightmare began. As the plane began to lurch violently to the right, the cabin lights flickered. Immediately, the people started to muffle their screams and gasps, but when they noticed that even the overhead bins were rattled, they could not hide it anymore. Samantha, on the other hand, was more worried about the fact that her drinks were now sloshing all over the tray tables. Immediately, she dropped the tray, found a seat, and gripped the armrest beside her as her heart began pounding. It wasn't her first time experiencing turbulence, but this one felt so different. Soon, a voice rang from the intercom, silenced the murmurs. The voice was that of the captain, and it was filled with so much tension as it cracked through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a situation." These were his first words, and his first words alone were enough to send shivers down Samantha's spine. She knew what the code word for a situation was. To a layman, it simply meant something dangerous. The captain did not have time to say another word before the plane suddenly jolted again, this time more violently. As the plane jolted, the sound of a child wailing sprang from the back, and Samantha sprang into action. Swallowing her fear, she unbuckled her belt and stood up. She had received training for cases of emergencies like this, and she knew she could handle this. Slowly, she made her way down the aisle, and she had a smile on her face as she kept reassuring the passengers. "Please calm down, Ma. It's just turbulence. There is absolutely nothing to worry about," she said as she kept walking. As she said this, she saw Mark, the lead flight attendant, walking towards the cockpit with a smirk on his face. Why would he be smiling at a time like this? She said to herself, and knew that something was terribly wrong. Then it happened. Boom! An explosion rocked the entire plane, and immediately, the right side of the plane dipped. That was all it took for the passengers to become chaotic. They screamed, and all their phones, drinks, and carry-ons flew through the air. Every single oxygen mask dangled from above as a soft reminder that they may not make it out alive. Samantha continued to stagger, holding the rims of the seats to prevent herself from falling. Just then, an alarm blared through the speakers, and the scent of burning metal followed. This could only mean one thing. Their right engine was failing. Before they could process that, a voice sounded from the intercom, but this time, it was not the voice of the captain, and that was not a good sign. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Air Marshal Grant Davidson. I'm afraid to inform you that both of our pilots are down, and we need immediate assistance in the cockpit." Samantha could not believe her ears. Both of their pilots were down? How? The passengers obviously had the same question, because they gasped at the news, and as they began to cry and say their final prayers, one thought screamed through Samantha's head. If both pilots were down, who was flying the plane? Immediately, she rushed forward, pushing down all the travelers who stood in her path. When she finally reached the cockpit door, the air marshal's tall frame blocked her view, but she could see his face, and it was pale. They are unconscious, and I don't know why. The autopilot's is not even working. What are we going to do? He asked as his voice tightened. Samantha was not ready to die yet. In her head, she screamed, "Who can fly this thing?" But in reality, her voice was only a whisper. Davidson hesitated, and then, softly from behind, a very quiet but firm voice spoke. "I can." Speedily, Samantha turned to look at the man who had spoken. The man was in first class, and surprisingly, throughout the chaos, he was extremely calm. From his looks, Samantha guessed that he should probably be in his late 50s. His hair was silver, and he had on a pressed button-down and a very expensive watch. Samantha's eyes widened as she realized who the man was. It was the same man that she had denied an upgrade before takeoff. "Sir, you," she stammered, but the man did not have time for melodrama. "Young lady, I am an ex-pilot, and right now, I am the best chance you have if you actually want to make it out of this alive." Immediately, Samantha's throat went dry, and she was unable to speak, but outside, the lightning flashed, and the plane shuddered again. Time was not their friend. Samantha nodded, and the air marshal didn't hesitate either. The ex-pilot stepped in, and Samantha followed behind him. She could hear her pulse hammering in her ears as she walked. Inside the cockpit, it was even worse than she had imagined. The captain and his first officer were breathing, but they could not respond. Samantha noticed something. Sweats were beaded on their foreheads, and their limbs were limped as if they had been drugged. She knew she didn't have much time to investigate the matter, so she silently waited till the time was right. The wailing of the alarm brought her back, and she noticed that the altitude was also dropping. Still, she was curious, so she asked, "What exactly happened to them?" The air marshal did not meet her eyes. All he did was shake his head and say, "I have no idea. There was no sign of a struggle. And then, they just shut down." That explanation made very little sense to her. Immediately, the new pilot sat on the captain's seat, and his hands moved over the controls. His face was engulfed in a deep concentration. "Let me introduce myself. I am Daniel Cole. I had flown commercials for over 20 years before I finally retired. Now I need both of you to listen to me carefully and do everything I say." Samantha nodded as she pushed aside every single thing she thought she knew about protocol. This was not about rules. This was about survival. Daniel first tested the manual controls by flipping the switches, and then he cursed under his breath. "Shit, the autopilot override is not responding." Samantha had already been told this, but hearing it again made her stomach twist because it meant that they would not be able to regain complete control of the plane. Samantha glanced at the sky, hoping to get some sort of assurance, but she was met with dark clouds. "Please tell me what we can do," she said as she turned to Daniel. "Well," Daniel exhaled sharply before he spoke, "we will need to reroute the power manually if we are to stand a chance. But before we do that, I will need someone to check the electrical panel that is near the rear of the plane." Samantha froze. If her memory serves her right, that electrical panel was in the very same compartment as the cargo hold, and before they took off, she had heard the ground crew talking about a last-minute addition to the cargo manifest, and this one had not been screened. This was no time to be afraid. Grabbing the intercom, she said, "Mark, I need you to go to the rear electrical panel. Now." Mark responded with, "On it," and Daniel got to work. He continued to flick the controls as he adjusted the dials. Slowly, the plane began to stabilize, but still, they were losing altitude, and Samantha tightened her grip on the seat beside her. As she tried to keep steady, Mark's voice rang through the telecom. Samantha, you're gonna want to see this." Her heart began to slam against her ribs as she ran down the aisle till she got to the rear of the plane. There stood Mark, his face rigid. Finally, she saw what he saw. The electrical panel was open, and the wires were frayed. Their circuit was fried. At the center of it all, Samantha saw a small, unmarked device blinking red. "Oh my God!" Her voice came out shaking as Mark turned to her and said the word she was thinking. "This was not an accident. Someone sabotaged this flight. Someone purposely does not want us to land safely." Samantha ran back to the cabin, scanning the terrified passengers' faces. Among them was someone responsible for this, and they were not done. As Karoline Leavitt sat in the airport lounge, visibly angry, she began to scroll through her phone to take her mind off the events that had just happened. Then, a notification came through her phone, and it was a secured message from a classified government source. The message held just 3 words: "Do not board." As she looked at the text, her heart kept pounding loudly. She could tell that the message had come in late, and that could mean just one thing. The flight that she could not board was in very serious danger. She did not know the full details, but the little she knew was enough to get her moving. She jumped from her seat and rushed to the nearest security desk. As she moved, she kept shoving all the startled travelers who saw the petrified look on her face and tried to hold her to calm her down. "Get off me!" she screamed as she shoved them all away and moved to an airport official. "I need to speak to the air traffic control now." The security guard saw the petrified look on her face and knew that he would first need to calm her down before he could allow her to speak. "Ma, please, you need to calm down. Tell me, what's going on?" Karoline took an intense breath and looked into the eyes of the security man. She needed someone who could be reliable, because what she was about to say was intense. "Okay, the plane I was removed from, that plane was not supposed to take off because a security threat was flagged minutes before it departed. There is a cyber attack targeting that flight's systems, and what you need to do right now is to contact them and tell them to start coming back before it's too late." The officer looked at her sternly. She did not appear to be lying. Plus, he knew exactly who she was. Immediately, he picked up his phone. On the plane, Samantha held onto the seat that was in front of her as the plane kept moving violently. She did not know which to focus on, the screams of the passengers or the wailing of the alarm. All she could do was pray that she would come out of this unhurt. She watched tiredly as the flight marshal rushed to the cockpit without saying a word to her. And then everywhere went silent, because just outside the cockpit door, the marshal collapsed, and once again Samantha's heart sank. Something was definitely wrong. She did not bother rushing to meet the marshal. No, her legs were too heavy to make that move, so she allowed her eyes to do the work. She searched around frantically, and at that moment, she saw him. The man wore a dark hoodie, and he moved in the opposite direction as the panicked passengers. Immediately, Samantha recognized him. That was the very same man who was arguing with Karoline outside their gate. It was also the same man who she had let through. Suddenly, her stomach did not feel like a pit anymore. It felt like a black hole. In her petty behavior, she had onboarded the real danger. Samantha's legs were still too heavy to move, so she just gasped when she saw the man dip his hand into his coat and bring out a hidden weapon. Samantha looked around and saw mothers, children, and youth screaming. It then dawned on her that this was all her fault. If she had just overlooked a simple clerical error, the plane wouldn't be in this trouble, and these lives wouldn't be in danger. Instead of doing that, she allowed a terrorist to board the plane without looking twice at his documents. It was all her fault, but she wasn't going to stand back and let him hurt innocent people. Her instinct took over, and Samantha lunged at the nearest tray table she could find. Swinging it, it landed on the man's wrist, and his weapon clattered to the floor. Soon, people around could see what was happening, and they jumped into action. Judging from the reflexes of one of them, Samantha could say that he was a former Marine. This Marine tackled him from behind and locked him in a chokehold. Soon, more and more passengers joined and wrestled the man into submission. All this while, the plane kept going in its terrifying descent. The damage was already done, and even though that little moment of victory made the passengers feel good, it did not save them from the fact that they would soon crash and die. The alarms kept blaring, and Samantha, fueled by the courage she had gained from her actions, scrambled to the cockpit. She saw that the pilots were still unconscious and losing altitude fast. She looked around for anything that could help, and then she heard the static-ridden voice over the intercom. "Flight 237, do you copy? This is ground control. Do you copy?" Immediately, Samantha scrambled for the intercom and responded with a hopeful voice. "Yes, I copy. We have overridden the cyber attack, and we advise you to take your hands off the controls as your system is currently stabilizing." Samantha breathed out as she felt a weight being lifted off her. She collapsed against the cockpit and realized that the plane was slowly leveling out. She felt the chaos dying out, and a few minutes later, the aircraft made a rough emergency landing. Immediately after they landed, fire trucks and federal agents surrounded the tarmac, and the doors were wrenched open. Samantha watched as people scrambled outside, and she staggered down the stairs. Down there, Karoline Leavitt and several FBI agents waited for her. Samantha locked eyes with Karoline and could not say a word, but she knew. Karoline had warned her, but she had been too pompous to get it, and her mistake had nearly cost hundreds of lives. As Samantha reached the floor, ready to be yelled at by her boss, she saw reporters run towards her, desperate for a story. Through it all, she could hear them saying, "Brave flight attendant foils terrorist attack." Samantha forced a smile. Karoline had not ratted her out, and she was grateful. But now, only both of them would know the truth, that she had almost gotten all of them killed.